Working in a space like this gives me the opportunity to connect back to country. So through taking that time of walking through the gardens in a city area, but also taking that time to sit down, deeply listen to country, hear the wind blowing through the trees, the birds singing, and also the animals rustling through to find their way. You don't really normally find that within a cityscape like Sydney. My name is Renee Cawthorne and I'm Manager of First Nations Education and Engagement at the Royal Botanic Gardens in Sydney. And today you're actually in the Botanic Gardens on Gadigal country. Inside the Royal Botanic Gardens in Sydney, we have the Catijam Aura Garden. And this garden is dedicated to the First Nations peoples of the area, but also to the local plants. And when you're in this space, you can actually see what the landscape would have looked like around 200 years ago, but also learn about the history of and use of the plants by First Nations people. I'm a Wiradjuri woman and my family come from Albury in New South Wales, but my grandmother was also a part of the Stolen Generations, so she grew up on a mission down at Narrandera. But I've been living on Darug country in Western Sydney for the last 10 to 15 years, and I've gained many good connections with the local communities within the Sydney area, but in particular on the land of the Darug peoples where I live. My grandmother being a part of the Stolen Generations and being removed from her family, when she was growing up, she wasn't allowed to practice her culture. So she wasn't allowed to speak her language, she wasn't allowed to tell the stories that had traditionally been told, which meant that a lot of that knowledge got suppressed and wasn't passed on to me. So when I became an adult and was looking more at my identity and who I am as a person, I went back to my community and learnt more about the stories, but also the language. And when I was there, I learned about the local bush foods, and my aunties were teaching me a lot about the local plants and their uses, and that gave me an interest to want to do some more research or learn more about the bush foods and medicines. Behind me, there is a grass tree here, which is also known as a Xanthorrhoea species. And this tree is really, really important to the local people of this area. Gadi means grass tree and Gal means people of. So the Gadigal are people of the grass tree. In my role as an educator, we basically teach primary and secondary school groups and take them through tours in the garden, also for the general public as well. What I love most about the Royal Botanic Gardens in Sydney is that it's a site of first colonisation. So it's one of the first sites that were impacted by the British settlement in Australia. And being able to tell those rich stories of history and culture is something that I feel very proud to do. So this plant here, it's called the Banksia. And does anyone know why it might be called the Banksia? Well, there was a guy called Sir Joseph Banks, and he was one of the first people to come here and look at the plants. So he was a botanist. And when he came into Kiama, which is now known as Botany Bay, he really fell in love with this plant in particular. And he spent 8 days in Kiama drawing the Banksia. And then he named it after himself and took this plant back to England and was one of the first plants to be cultivated in the Kew Botanic Gardens. So during spring, this tree here, it gets beautiful flowers, but once the leaves are all dry, they become really, really coarse. A bit like this one here, but I'm going to use the wet one so I can show you what we would actually do with it. So how did First Nations peoples brush their hair? They would use the cone of the Banksia, and you can see that it could be used like a brush as well. Working in the gardens brings back memories of learning about the stories on my country. So hearing them from my elders and the traditional owners really gives me that connection back to my people, but also back to my culture. So this plant here is called Lomandra longifolia, or also known as spiny-headed matrush. And it has many different uses by First Nations peoples. So the stalk here, you can see that it has these beautiful seeds on it, and they will flower during spring, giving you white or yellow flowers. But once they're dried out, you can also tap them and you'll see that the seeds actually drop from there. Well, these seeds can be mixed with some water ground into a powder and then kneaded to make some dough, which is what we use to make our Johnny cakes or our damper. Now this plant's very drought tolerant, so you can grow it anywhere. And it likes hardy soils, but also very saline soils. I guess what I love most is hearing people's questions and also their interest in wanting to learn about First Nations people and culture. So often people will come to the gardens, they would have seen some of these plants before, but not heard about the name of the plant or even their uses. And to change those negative views and opinions that people have gained about us in the past, and to really teach them the sophistication of our knowledge. Like I said, we're Australia's first botanist, first scientist. You know, we have managed and maintained Australia for over 65,000 years, which is a really long time. And we have the oldest continuous culture in the world. To be able to share that with people is really something that's quite special that you cannot get anywhere else.